Chapter 4 Law, State, and Capital. Political Economy and Jurisprudence. Questions of Method. Capital represents the maturation of Marx's critique of the economic forms of civil society and of his analysis of the social relations which lie concealed behind and give rise to these forms. His thesis was that economic categories can be understood only as the expression of a definite historical organization of labor. In the course of this critique, the gulf which existed in his early writings between the surface economic forms of civil society, value, price, money, capital, wage labor, etc., was overcome as he addressed the, quote, dialectical, end quote, question of why alienated labor should express itself in these forms. Marx offered a critique of political economy not only in the sense of replacing erroneous economic theories with better economic theories, but also in the sense of disclosing what kind of society provides the foundation for the emergence of an independent economic sphere of life. In other words, he offered a social critique of economics in general, and not just an internal critique of one economic theory or another. The theoretical hypothesis which he defended was that the key to understanding economic categories lay in an exposition of the social relations according to which men and women organize the labor of society. It is thus misleading to call the economic sphere the, quote, base, end quote, of society on which legal, political, and ideological superstructures rest. Rather, the message which runs through Capital is that social relations of production constitute the base of society, and the economic categories represent an expression of the base. The imaginary which informs Capital, however, is not that of base and superstructure, but rather that of, quote, form and, quote, content. Economics expressing the, quote, surface forms of capitalist society, the, quote, inner content or, quote, substance of which comprises social relations of production. The perspective from which Marx approached capital was that of starting with economic forms. For example, value, price, money, capital, interest, profit, etc., analyzing the specific relations of production which lie hidden beneath these forms, and then explaining, quote, synthetically, why these relations of production necessarily express themselves in this economic way. This method has given rise to the impression that the economic expression of relations of production is their only expression, as if there is an exclusive association between economics and social relations of production which is not shared by other forms of social life. The result is that law, politics, and ideology are in one way or another dissociated from relations of production. Quote, determined, end quote, by them perhaps, or, quote, relatively autonomous, end quote, of them, or only, quote, determined in the last instance, end quote, but not themselves a direct expression of the relations of production in the same way as economics. Economics becomes a privileged sphere while law, politics, and ideology appear as subordinate spheres. The basis of this privilege and subordination, however, is often quite arbitrary, appeals being made to supposedly self-evident truths that economics is more fundamental for the development of society than, say, the state. It seems to me that Marx at times identified, quote, economics, end quote, with relations of production, and at times saw, quote, economics, end quote, as an expression of the surface forms assumed by certain definite relations of production. In the former case, he treats economics as a universal sphere. Where am I? In the former case, he treats economics as a universal sphere, in the sense that relations of production in all societies are said to determine the general organization of society. In the latter, he treats the emergence of the economic sphere as a historical event, in that it is only under particular conditions that relations of production assume the economic forms of value, money, capital, etc. The important point is not the verbal definition of, quote, economics, end quote, but the theoretical differentiation between the content of capitalist society, i.e., social relations of production, and its forms of appearance, i.e., value, money, capital, etc., in order to gain consistency, I believe that it would be most useful if the term, quote, economics, end quote, were reserved for the latter, and thus clearly distinguished from its social content. The theme which appears on the edges of capital is that the social relations of capitalist production do not manifest themselves only in economic forms, but also in juridic forms. In other words, it should be possible to do what Marx intended in his early years, but then lost sight of as he delved deeper into his economic studies. That is, to complement his critique of political economy with a critique of jurisprudence, to start with juridic categories, analyze the social relations of production which lie hidden beneath them, and then explain, quote, synthetically, end quote, why these relations of production necessarily express themselves in juridic forms. Indeed, Marx outlined just such a program of study in his preface to the economical philosophical manuscripts. Quote, I shall therefore publish the critique of law, morals, politics, etc., in a series of separate independent pamphlets, and finally attempt in a special work to present them once again as a connected whole, to show the relationship between the parts, and to try to provide a critique of the speculative treatment of the material. That is why the present work only touches on the interconnection of political economy and the state, law, morals, civil life, etc., insofar as political economy itself particularly touches on these subjects, end quote. The traces of such an analysis in Capital point to a hypothesis that was not present in Marx's earlier writings, that the selfsame relations of production which gave rise to the economic form of capitalist society also gave rise to its juridic forms, that not only are economic and juridic categories both expressions of historical relations of production, but that they are expressions of the same historical relations of production. But all this was only on the sidelines of Marx's critique of political economy. It appeared to many Marxists that social relations between people could only take the form of material relations between things, i.e., economics, ignoring the pressing fact that they also take the form of legal relations between persons as owners of private property. Capital caught one side of the fetishism of capitalist society, that the economic forms assumed by the products of labor under definite relations of production, value, capital, wage, labor, etc., appear as natural qualities of the products of labor themselves, as if it were the case that, as political economy thought, value is a natural property of anything produced by human hands, or that capital is a natural characteristic of the means of production as such, or that wage labor is the natural form assumed by all labor. But it only touched on another side of the fetishism of capitalist society, that the legal forms assumed by producers under definite relations of production, ownership of private property, free will, equal right, law, state authority, appear as natural qualities of people, as if it were the case that, as jurisprudence assumed, they are attributes of human nature or human reason as such. The tangential influence of such a critique in Marx's work has led most interpreters to neglect this side of the question. The practical result of this neglect has been most unfortunate. The idea that social relations between people have been reduced by capitalism to material relations between things will rightly be unconvincing to those who can see before their very eyes that capitalism also brings with it the idea of the integrity of the human personality, free will, equality before the law, rights of the individual, and so forth. The critique of the materialist, i.e., economic aspect of capitalist society, will necessarily be one-sided and vulnerable if it is not accompanied by a critique of its humanist, i.e., juridic aspect. The critique of political economy has to be integrated with the critique of jurisprudence. One consequence of this neglect among Marxists of juridic forms of capitalist relations of production has been to reduce them to the status of illusions or mirages. Such an approach is in complete contravention Such an approach is in complete contravention to the method Marx employed in his critique of political economy. When Marx uses the term form and contrasts the term form with content, he does not mean that the form is illusory and that the content is real. When, for example, he discusses the value form of commodities, his object was first to show the limitations of political economy, which attempted to explain magnitudes of value, i.e., why products have one price rather than another, but ignored the form of value, why products bear prices at all. Second, to show that the value form is a social form, which presupposes the existence of definite social relations of production. Third, to show that although the value form is social, it appears either as a natural quality of material objects, vulgar political economy, or as a natural result of human labor, classical political economy. Fourth, to show why social relations of commodity production must necessarily express themselves in the form of the value of things. The imagery of form and content is quite different from that of illusion and reality. The surface form of an object is not less real than its inner content, but it can be explained only by reference to its inner content. Similarly, inner content of an object cannot be envisaged independently of its surface form, as if the one can be separated from the other. Once the value form is established, it acts as a real constraint on human behavior and is a real mediation between human beings. The Russian Marxist economist Rubin, for instance, writing in the 1920s, has a useful discussion of the complementarity between the hidden process of, quote, reification, by means of which production relations between people give to products their specific economic form, and the overt process of, quote, personification, end quote, by means of which the value form of the product determines and mediates relations between people. Juridic forms of capitalist production relations are every bit as real as their economic forms. Just as Marx in no way meant that, because value, money, capital, and wage labor are forms of appearance of capitalist relations of production, they are not also real social forces that mediate relations between people and kick back at the people who create them. So too, juridic forms of capitalist relations of production are also real social forces. There is nothing illusory about the court laws, the police, and the prisons, which also mediate relations between people and constrain those who create them. The fact that Marx focused in his theoretical writings on the economic forms of capitalist production relations, and not on their juridic forms, should not lead one to suppose that juridic forms are any less substantial than their economic counterparts. The other major consequence of the neglect among Marxists of juridic forms has been not to discount them as fictions, but to idealize them. The other major consequence of the neglect among Marxists of juridic forms has been not to discount juridic forms as fictions, but to idealize juridic forms as eternal truths. The connections linking ideas of justice, law, rights, and so forth to capitalist relations of production are lost from sight, with the result that these ideas, instead of appearing as what they are, that is, the ideas of real men and women in society, are abstracted from their human origins and acquire a life of their own, such as the case with Proudhon, who saw, quote, justice, end quote, as a, quote, eternal idea, end quote, with which to attack aspects of capitalist society like usury or exploitation. Although this provided a critical standpoint from which to expose the hypocrisy associated with private property, Proudhon failed to see that his conception of justice reflected the self-same relations of production, the economic forms of which he rejected. Thus, while the idea of, quote, free and equal exchange, end quote, which informs Proudhon's conception of justice, allowed him to be critical of capital and of usury, it also led him to be equally critical of the combination of workers into trade unions on the grounds that, quote, each worker individually should dispose freely of his person and his hands. This can be tolerated, but that workers should undertake by combination to do violence to monopoly is something society cannot permit. End quote. Proudhon. It was precisely Proudhon's abstraction of juridic forms from capitalist relations of production which took Marx away from being an admirer of Proudhon into being his critic. Quote, Proudhon creates his ideal of justice eternal, from the juridical relations that correspond to the production of commodities. Proudhon thereby proves to the consolation of all good petty bourgeois, that the production of commodities is a form as eternal as justice. Do we really know any more about, quote, usury when we say it contradicts eternal justice, eternal equity, eternal mutuality, and other eternal truths? I don't know, that last bit's all in French, so take it with a grain of salt if my translations are they might not be right. End quote. Proudhon serves here as an exemplar of an approach to law which has adherents within contemporary Marxism on the idea of private property. Marx's critique of jurisprudence was, to the extent that he developed it, like his critique of political economy, not just an internal critique of one legal theory by another, but an uncovering of the social foundation of legal thought in its entirety. It was a critique aimed at the fetishized character of law in which social relations between people appear in the form of private relations between people and things, rights to property, and thence to the form of personal subordination to an impersonal embodiment of those rights, government of laws rather than people, just as it was necessary for Marx to complement his critique of religion with a critique of those social relations which gave rise to religion. So too his critique of law was complemented by a critique of relations that clothe themselves in legal mysteries. The starting point for Marx's critique of law was private property, just as value was the starting point for his critique of political economy. Thus, in his contribution to the critique of political economy, he wrote that, quote, Hegel correctly takes ownership, the simplest legal relation of the subject, as the point of departure for the philosophy of law. End quote. He regarded private property not as something separate from law, Thus, in his contribution to the critique of political economy, he wrote that, quote, Hegel correctly takes ownership, the simplest legal relation of the subject, as the point of departure for the philosophy of law. End quote. He regarded private property not as something separate from law, as if their connections were purely contingent, but rather as the elementary, quote, cell, end quote, of legal thought. The supersession of private property was therefore at once the supersession of law, the idealization of law, conversely was the idealization of private property. In the 1844 manuscripts, Marx contrasted the human way in which men and women relate to the natural world around them to the alienated appropriation of things in the form of private property. In the first case, people relate to the world through all their senses, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, etc., and by so doing turn all objects into, quote, human objects, objectifications of themselves, end quote, which develop, realize, and confirm their individuality. In the case of private property, sensual appropriation of objects is subordinated to possessing, having, owning things. Appropriation of nature in the form of private property becomes a, quote, means of life, rather than a realization of one's individuality. Quote, private property has made us so stupid and one-sided that an object is only ours when we have it. End quote. The more people become what they own, the less they are themselves, until even their personal qualities appear as possessions that can be bought and sold on the marketplace. Quote, the less you are, the less you give expression to your life. The more you have, the greater is your alienated life. End quote. From the perspective of jurisprudence, private property appears as the external embodiment of individual will in things. In fact, private property signifies the alienation of the individual, who is reduced to no more than an owner of things, and whose identity is reduced to the things he or she owns. Thus, private property was analyzed by Marx in the manuscripts as the alienation of, quote, human existence, end quote, and of a, quote, human way, end quote, of inhabiting nature. The advance which Smith made over the mercantilist was that the latter treated private property, quote, as purely objective being for man, end quote, where Smith recognized that labor is the, quote, subjective essence, end quote, or, quote, principle, end quote, of private property. Hegel translated Locke's natural law imperative that people have a right to the product of their own labor into the scientific doctrine that labor is the substance of private property. Smith never, however, once asked the question why this content has assumed this particular form. That is to say, why labor is expressed in private property. While all human labor produces material objects, i.e. use values, the question which Marx posed was what specific kind of labor produces use values in the alien form of private property. By ignoring the form of property, Smith, quote, transfers private property into the essence of man, end quote. This illusion can be broken only by seeing private property as the product of a specific kind of labor, alienated labor, in which the objects of labor appear as something, quote, alien to their producers. Quote, this realization of labor appears as a loss of reality for the worker, end quote. In the manuscripts, Marx based his critique of private property on a contrast between human and inhuman ways of appropriating nature. Private property represents the dominance of the material world over, quote, the human element, end quote, while communism represents the triumph of the human element over the material world. Capitalist reality is condemned in the name of a communist ideal, the world of what is in the name of the world as it should be. The error of classical jurisprudence was to presuppose private property, while the strength of Proudhon was to expose private property to critical examination. Marx's transition from utopian to scientific socialism, that is, from a radicalized natural law theory to historical materialism, led him to explore the juridic form of private property and the contradictory character of productive relations which express themselves in this form. In his critique of political economy, Grundrisse, and Capital, the vast bulk of Marx's work was centered on a critique of the economic forms assumed by capitalist relations of production. No comparable critique of the fetish of private property, law, and the state was written by Marx. We have, however, a basis for such a critique in Marx's own sporadic comments on jurisprudence, in his substantive analysis of capitalist relations of production, and in the method he developed for his critique of political economy. In the section which follows, I shall just be skimming the surface of what is required for a critique of jurisprudence in order to bring to light the dialectical view of bourgeois freedom and equality which informed Marx's later writings and the contradictory relation he saw between juridic forms and their substantive content. Why, Marx asked, should private property, that is, a definite form of property whose historical emergence classical jurisprudence had itself traced, nonetheless appear as a natural and rational institution valid for all times and places? Classical jurisprudence had squared this circle by treating all previous forms of property as distortions of private property by political and moral constraints. That is, private property appeared as a natural relation between people and things, corrupted in all pre-capitalist societies by the imposition of external obligations. It seemed, in other words, as though private property was a starting point for analysis, even though its realization only came at the end of history with what was seen as the lifting of constraints upon it. The root of this mystique was that private property appeared as a relation between individuals and things constructed in private rather than as the expression of a definite social relation between people. In all societies, Marx argued, there must exist some form of property. Quote, production is always appropriation of nature by an individual within and with the help of a definite social organization. In this context, it is quite tautological to say that property, appropriation, is a condition of production, end quote, or that, quote, where no form of property exists, there can be no production and no society either. Appropriation, which appropriates nothing, is a contradiction in terms, end quote. However, Marx adds, quote, it is quite ridiculous to make a leap from this to a distinct form of property, e.g., private property, end quote. Different forms of property express different relations of production. It is the nature of social relations between people that determines the form in which the natural world is appropriated by them. In the Grundrisse, Marx traces some of the characteristics of pre-capitalist forms of property which distinguish them from bourgeois forms of private property. The key to these earlier forms was that appropriation of the objective conditions of labor, land, tools, etc., took place not through labor, but rather on the basis of the individual's existence as a member of the community. Ownership of land and of other instruments of labor was presupposed by productive activity and not the result of productive activity. It was only as a member of a community that an individual could possess property, and the property that individuals possess derived from their membership of a community. The notion that all individuals equally have a right to the product of their own labor was entirely alien to such societies. For example, in the, quote, clan communities, end quote, of which Oriental despotism was one example, the, quote, communality of blood, language, customs is the first presupposition for the appropriation of the objective condition of their life. They relate to the earth naively as the property of the community. Each individual conducts himself only as a link, as a member of this community, as possessor. The real appropriation through the labor process happens under these presuppositions, which are not themselves the product of labor, but appear as its natural and or divine presuppositions, end quote. In the classical community of antiquity, communal property is separated from private property. On the one hand, individuals may become private proprietors of land, but on the other, communal property is their bond and safeguard against internal and external foes. Quote, membership of the commune remains a presupposition for appropriation of land and soil, but as a member of the commune, the individual is a private proprietor. The individual is placed in such conditions of earning his living as to make not the acquiring of wealth his object, but his own reproduction as a member of the community. The survival of the commune is the reproduction of all of the commune's members as self-sustaining peasants whose surplus time belongs precisely to the commune, end quote. Among German tribes, as a third example, the commune exists only, quote, as a periodic gathering together of the commune members, end quote, settled not in cities but long distances apart in the country. The commune, in other words, comes into being only when the landed proprietors, whose economic existence is centered on the individual household, hold a meeting. Public land is merely a complement to individual property, land that is reserved for hunting, grazing, timber, etc., that cannot be divided if it is to serve these productive functions. Apart from this communal land, which is really no more than the common property of the individual proprietors, quote, the commune exists only in the interrelation among these individual landed proprietors as such, end quote. Nevertheless, membership of this commune remains a presupposition for the appropriation of land as property. Since in all these societies it was only as a member of a community that an individual could possess property, it followed that, quote, an isolated individual could no more have property in land and soil than he could speak. The individual can never appear here in the dot-like isolation in which he appears as mere free worker, end quote. Marx's purpose in these passages was not only to show, as classical jurisprudence has already perceived in its own way, that private property is a historical accomplishment, but also to demonstrate that all forms of property depend on social relations between people. If private property appears as a private relation between individuals and things, then this must be the mystified consequence of a particular organization of productive relations, and not of a transubstantiation of the nature of property. Historically, what needs to be explained is not the, quote, unity of living and active humanity with the natural inorganic conditions of their metabolic exchange with nature, end quote, since originally human beings' relation to their natural conditions of production was presupposed along with their own being as members of a community, but rather, quote, the separation between these inorganic conditions of human existence and his active existence, end quote. In other words, the idea that ownership of property could be an attribute of the abstract individual taken in isolation from other people is the juridic fetish of the modern age. The question is, where does this fetish derive from? Before tracing Marx's answer to this, it should be noted that Marx no longer romanticized pre-bourgeois property relations as in any sense, quote, superior, end quote, to those of private property. If Marx's critique of the fetish of the abstract individual is taken as his sole yardstick for assessing different modes of production, it would be easy to conclude that bourgeois private property represents a regression from these older forms. Those commentaries which compare on the one side bourgeois private property and on the other all other forms of property, primitive communist, ancient Greek, feudal, patriarchal, socialist, etc., tend to obscure the particular restrictions associated with older forms of property which bourgeois private property broke asunder. Within traditional forms of property, although the individual was seen as a member of a community, relations within the community itself appeared to derive from divine or natural origins, as reflected in traditional natural law theory, and the origins of property and human labor were more or less completely obscured. Those who were not members of the community were deemed incapable of owning property, as was expressly articulated in Roman law. Consequently, slavery and serfdom, in which labor itself appeared among the objective conditions of production, emerged as necessary developments of these relations. Under slavery, as Marx put it, quote, the worker is distinguishable only as instrumentum vocale from an animal which is instrumentum semivocale, and from a lifeless implement which is instrumentum mutum, end quote. Such forms of property founded on the labor of slaves, serfs, retainers, servants, etc., had as their natural basis the inequality of human beings and of their labor. Further, the classical view, according to which good citizens and human beings rather than wealth were the aim of production, quote, seems to be very lofty when contrasted to the modern world, where production appears as the aim of mankind and wealth as the aim of production, end quote. But what is wealth, Marx asks, rejecting the classicist critique of modernity, quote, other than the universality of individual needs, capacities, pleasures, productive forces, the full development of human mastery over the forces of nature, those of so-called nature as well as humanity's own nature, end quote. The mark of traditional property relations was restricted development of the forces of production, of society, and of the individual. The fault of private property was not that it broke through these restrictions, nor that it aimed at the unlimited production of wealth, nor that it was premised on, quote, the equality and equivalence of all kinds of labor, insofar as they are human labor in general, end quote, nor that it posited property as a human institution predicated on human labor. These were, as Marx learnt from Smith and Hegel, its great strengths. Rather, its defect lay in the alienated form in which these achievements were secured. The separation of property from its presuppositions in the community represented a twofold process. On the one hand, the cutting of the real ties which bind individuals to the community of which they are part. The rise of the mythology of property as a private attribute, the pursuit of private interests without regard for the interests of others, the treatment of others as means to one's own private ends. On the other, the breaking of the real chains which subordinated the development of the individual and the forces of production to reproducing the limited, one-sided aim of natural community. Marx thus abandoned his earlier conception of civil society as the worst possible slavery in favor of a dialectical view of its historical progressiveness. This new position was reflected politically in his attacks on, quote, feudal socialism, end quote, whose protagonists were anti-capitalist from the perspective of the old order, without being pro-socialist. Freedom, equality, and commodity production. From where, then, does private property as a determinate form of property actually emerge? The society which gives rise to it is one that is based on private production by isolated producers, whose contact with each other is mediated entirely through the exchange of their products on the market. In such a society, producers are free to produce what and how much they wish. They are equal in that no one producer can force any other to produce against his or her will, nor expropriate the means of production or the products of other producers against their will. Sorry, I spaced out. The society which gives rise to private property is one that is based on private production by isolated producers whose contact with each other is mediated entirely through the exchange of their products on the market. In such a society, the producers are free to produce what and how much they wish. They are equal in that no one producer can force any other producer to produce against his or her will, nor expropriate the means of production or the products of other producers against their will. They are independent in that they are all entitled to pursue their own private interests regardless of what others think or do. Their contact with other producers is a matter left to their own desires and needs, and contact with each other takes the form of a free and equal exchange in which one individual alienates his or her own private property in return for the private property that belongs to another. In so doing, they give up unneeded things in return for useful things for the mutual benefit of each party. In short, a society based on petty commodity production provides the historical foundation for private property. Under these circumstances, the exchange relation appears as a self-sufficient relation, divorced from any particular mode of production, between free and equal property owners who enter a voluntary contract in pursuit of their own self-interest. The exchange relation itself makes no reference to the circumstances in which individuals seek to exchange, nor to the characteristics of the commodities offered for exchange. In exchange, Marx argues, quote, all inherent contradictions of bourgeois society appear extinguished. and bourgeois democracy even more than the bourgeois economists, i.e., jurisprudence more than political economy, take refuge in this aspect, insofar as the commodity is conceived of as exchange value, or in juridic terms as private property, and the relation as the exchange of these exchange values, i.e., of private property, then the individuals, the subjects between whom this process goes on, are simply and only conceived of as exchangers, i.e., as owners of private property. As far as their formal character is concerned, there is no distinction between them as subjects of exchange. The relation is therefore that of equality. It is impossible to find any trace of distinction, not to speak of contradiction between them, not even a difference. Furthermore, the commodities which they exchange are as exchange values, i.e., as private property equivalent. The exchange of the content of the exchange, which lies altogether outside its economic and juridic character, far from endangering the equality of individuals, rather makes the individuals' natural difference into the basis of their social equality. Only the difference between their needs and between their products gives rise to exchange, and to their social equation in exchange. These natural differences are therefore the preconditions of their social equality in the act of exchange. End quote. Exchange appears not only as a relation of equality between property owners, but also as one of freedom and mutual respect for the freedom of others. Quote, each confronts the other as owner of the object of the other's need. This proves that each of them reaches beyond his own particular need as a human being, and that they relate to each other as human beings. Thus there enters, in addition to the quality of equality, that of freedom. Although individual A feels a need for the commodity of individual B, individual A does not appropriate individual B's commodity by force, nor vice versa. But individuals A and B recognize one another reciprocally as proprietors, as persons whose will penetrates their commodities. Accordingly, the juridical moment of the person enters here. End quote. Out of this relation, there appears to emerge behind the backs of the parties to the exchange a common interest, one that is not counterposed to the particular interest of individuals, but rather based precisely on the reciprocal development of self-interest. In other words, it is not an alien, quote, common interest, end quote, which arises, but one that cannot be separated from the autonomous development of each individual. The only compulsion which enters the relation is one that stems not from an alien force, but only from my own needs, drives, and nature. The exchange relationship appears as natural and rational because it respects and embodies these human qualities of equality, freedom, mutual respect, and mutual need. To the extent that exchange relations comprise the means of association between owners of private property, it would therefore seem that they represent a truly human form of social contact based on the integrity as well as the needs of the private individual. In exchange relations, owners of private property, quote, must place themselves in relation to one another as persons whose will resides in those objects, and must behave in such a way that each does not appropriate the commodity of the other and alienate his own except through an act to which both parties consent. This juridical relation, whose form is the contract, whether as part of a developed legal system or not, is a relation between two wills which mirrors the economic relation. End quote. While it appears that the eternal human qualities of freedom and equality are respected in exchange relations, in fact, exchange relations are their material basis. Quote, as pure ideas, freedom and equality are merely the idealized expressions of this basis. As developed in juridical, political, social relations, they are merely this basis to a higher power. equality and freedom developed to this extent are exactly the opposite of the freedom and equality in the world of antiquity, where developed exchange value and thus private property was not their basis, but where, rather, the development of that basis destroyed them. Equality and freedom presuppose relations of production as yet unrealized in the ancient world and in the Middle Ages. End quote. Marx saw the development of juridic freedom and equality as a great advance. No longer did they appear to him as an ideal when applied to the state, or as an empty form or illusion when applied to civil society. Rather than rest his analysis on the forced abstraction of the state from civil society, and of civil society from the state, he now viewed juridic relations between free and equal owners of private property, alongside economic relations between commodities bearing value, as antithetical social forms, the secret to whose riddles lay in the unraveling of the social relations of commodity production. He was now in a position to explore the contradictory nature of the formal freedoms and equalities traversing state and civil society alike. The myth of private property as a private relation between individuals and things is dissolved once the abstraction of exchange from production is abandoned. The presupposition of exchange is a definite organization of production, one which forces producers to exchange their products, for they cannot survive nor reproduce except by exchanging their products, and which determines socially the form and content of their private interests. Quote, "The private interest is itself a socially determined interest, which can be achieved only within the conditions laid down by society, and with the means provided by society." End quote. The real point of departure is not the private individual as he or she appears at the moment of exchange, but rather, quote, individuals producing in society, hence socially determined individuals, end quote. The presuppositions of commodity production are, first, an extended division of labor, though Marx now clearly saw what he and Engels had confused in their early writings, namely that, although, quote, the division of labor is a necessary condition for commodity production, the converse does not hold. Commodity production is not a necessary condition for the social division of labor. Only the products of mutually independent acts of labor performed in isolation can confront each other as commodities. End quote. Second, the dissolution of all relations of personal dependence, such as those that characterized feudal relations between serfs, lords, vassals, suzerains, laypersons, and clerics, and all community restraints on the ownership and use of property. Third, quote, the all-sided dependence of the producers on one another, end quote, since the individual act of private production presupposes that individuals will find available in the market the things necessary to satisfy the individual's needs. In short, commodity exchange is premised on the reciprocal and all-sided dependence of commodity producers, which compels them to exchange. The positive aspect of this development was that for the first time, objective social connections were made not only between all producers within a community, but, as the world market inexorably grows, between all producers in the world. Quote, this objective social connection is certainly preferable to the lack of any connection or to merely local connection. Individuals cannot gain mastery over their own social connections before they have created those social connections. The alien character of the bond between commodity producers consists, therefore, not in the fact of their mutual interdependence, but in that mutual interdependence's mode, both the form of their interconnections, a contract between two private parties based on the exchange of their property, and their content, the terms on which such contracts for the exchange of goods are made are entirely out of the control of the producers and thus become an alien force above them. Quote, ties of personal dependence are exploded. Individuals seem independent, but they appear thus only for someone who abstracts from these conditions of production. The definedness of individuals, which in the former case appears as the personal restriction of the individual by another individual, appears in the latter case as developed into an objective restriction of the individual by relations independent of him. These external relations are very far from being an abolition of, quote, relations of dependence, end quote. They are rather the dissolution of these relations in general form. Individuals are now ruled by abstractions, whereas earlier they depended upon one another. The abstraction is nothing more than the theoretical expression of those material relations which are their lord and master, end quote. Since commodity producers labor privately, in isolation from one another, quote, the social character of their activity appears as something alien and objective, confronting the individuals not as their relations to one another, but as their subordination to relations which subsist independently of them and which arise out of collisions between mutually indifferent individuals, end quote. Equality before the law is a formal property of exchange relations between private property owners. In general, this appearance of equality is dissolved once one explores the content of exchange. In a famous passage in his critique of the Gotha program, Marx wrote that the equal rights of parties to an exchange necessarily entail, as their consequence, substantive inequality. Quote, equal right is a right of inequality in its content, like every right. Right by its nature can only consist in the application of an equal standard insofar as they are brought under an equal point of view, or taken from one definite side only. To avoid all these defects, right instead of being equal would have to be unequal, end quote. In other words, equal treatment of unequal individuals and individuals would not be individuals if they were not unequal, leads to inequality. In Anatole France's famous example, a law forbidding the rich and the poor equally from sleeping under the bridge at Paris would be most unequal in its effects. While, however, a tension between equal rights and substantive inequality is a tension in all exchange relations, and reveals the folly of those who would idealize the mediation of social relations by law, the nature and degree of that inequality are determined by productive relations. It is an entirely abstract critique of law that leaves the matter at that and fails to investigate how, quote, the form and content of equal right are changed, end quote, as productive relations themselves change. While equality before the law always means inequality in fact, it is compatible with entirely different levels and forms of inequality. In the book Capital, Marx analyzes how the content of equal right. In Capital, Marx analyzed how the content of equal right changed with the development of capitalist relations of production, changes which reveal a dynamic relation between juridic forms of equality and their social content. It should be noted here that Marx did not analyze how forms of equal right changed with the development of capitalist relations of production. This was beyond his scope in a critique of political economy, and is a question to which I return later. Freedom, equality, and capitalist relations of production. Where commodity production is sporadic or peripheral, exchange takes the form of occasional barter between isolated individuals or groups. In the first instance, usually one tribe exchanging surplus goods with another tribe. The terms of the exchange are determined by the producers themselves, and each producer has to defend his or her rights of private property by force of arms. Even club law, as Marx put it, is law. With the generalization of commodity production, one commodity becomes the embodiment of human labor in the abstract and assumes the economic form of money. competition between producers will ensure that commodities exchange at their values, that is, according to the socially necessary labor time that enters their production, there is no guarantee that the actual labor time of the individual will correspond with the labor time that is socially necessary. For instance, a peasant farmer on good land will, other things being equal, be more productive than a peasant on bad land. Equal right in those circumstances entails that some producers exchange their commodities for more than their actual labor time, and some for less. That is, a particular mode of inequality which will lead to the impoverishment of some and enrichment of others, as illustrated, for example, in the differentiation of the peasantry in pre-capitalist societies. Quote, if one grows impoverished and the other grows wealthier, then this is of their own free will. Even inheritance does not prejudice this natural freedom and equality. End quote. Under these circumstances, producers may have to be forced to be free, since a good deal of coercion will be required to ensure that proprietors' rights to free exchange are guaranteed against those who are impoverished as a consequence. For free and equal exchange to be sustained under the pressure of these substantive inequalities, a force is required over and beyond that exercised by the producers themselves to protect property rights. From where is this force to arise? We shall see that the problem and its solution arose simultaneously with the emergence of law as the independent and objective form assumed by property right. I shall reserve exploration of this formal aspect of the question, which Marx did not pursue till later. With the means of production becoming the property of some and the non-property of the vast majority, the economic forms of capital and wage labor emerge. The relations between them still takes the form of free and equal exchange between commodity producers, but the particular form and content of this exchange have changed. Quote, the sphere of circulation of commodity exchange, within whose boundaries the sale and purchase of labor power goes on, is in fact a very Eden of the innate rights of man. It is the exclusive realm of freedom, equality, property, and Bentham. Freedom, because both buyer and seller of a commodity, let us say labor power, are determined only by their own free will. They contract as free persons who are equal before the law. Equality, because each enters into relations with the other as with a simple owner of commodities, and as they exchange equivalent with equivalent. Property, because each disposes only what is his own. And Bentham, because each looks only to his own advantage. The only force bringing them together is the selfishness, the gain, and the private interest of each. End quote. On the surface of capitalist society, the relation between capitalist and worker is a simple exchange, each obtaining an equivalent from the other, the one obtaining money in the form of a wage, and the other a use value, labor power. In the movement which proceeds on the surface of the bourgeois world, quote, a worker who buys a loaf of bread and a millionaire who does the same appear in this act as simple buyers. All other aspects are extinguished. The content of these purchases appears as completely irrelevant compared with the formal aspect. End quote. So too the exchange between capitalist and worker appears just like any other exchange, and each appears as an equal. In fact, the exchange between capitalist and worker expresses a completely different social relation from that between two petty commodity producers. Nobody enters exchange as an abstract individual, but rather as an individual rooted in definite social relations. Quote, not relations between individual and individual, but between worker and capitalist, between farmer and landlord, etc. Wipe out these relations and you annihilate all society. End quote. The distinctive feature of the exchange between capitalist and worker, which differentiates it from exchange between buyers and sellers in general, lies in its content. A new commodity has entered the market which did not previously exist as a commodity, namely labor power. Its historical presupposition lay in the double freedom of the worker, freedom on the one hand from relations of personal dependence, bondage, servitude, etc., and on the other from ownership of the means of production and subsistence. Similarly, the buyer of this new commodity, labor power, is no longer a simple buyer who seeks to use it as an object of personal consumption, as in the case of a household employing a servant, but rather one who uses it specifically for the production of surplus value. The wage form obscures this relation. It appears that workers exchange not their labor power, but rather their labor in return for a wage. Since workers are employed by the day, the week, the year, the piece, etc., it appears as though they are paid for the entire labor. The only question then becomes whether workers receive a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, i.e., whether the exchange of equivalents is in fact being upheld. In fact, the wage form constitutes only the surface of a relation inherently based on exploitation. But it is this form which above all generates bourgeois ideas of justice, freedom, and equality. Quote, the wage form thus extinguishes every trace of the division of the working day into the necessary labor and surplus labor, into paid labor and unpaid labor. All labor appears as paid labor. We may therefore understand the decisive importance of the transformation of the value and price of labor power into the form of wages, or into the value and price of labor itself. All the notions of justice held by both the worker and the capitalist, all the mystifications of the capitalist mode of production, all capitalism's illusions about freedom, all the apologetic tricks of vulgar economics have as their basis the form of appearance discussed above, which makes the actual relations invisible and indeed presents to the eye the precise opposite to that relation. End quote. Marx's recognition that workers sell their labor power and not their labor was of crucial significance for his analysis of the substantive inequality which lies behind equal exchange between capitalist and laborer. The hidden secret behind the exchange between capital and labor is that workers receive in the form of wages a value equivalent to the value of their labor power and not of their, quote, labor, end quote. And the value of their labor power is less than the value which their labor, put to use by the capitalist, is able to generate. Part of the value so created is expropriated without return by the capitalist as surplus value. In this case, unlike that of petty commodity production, unpaid surplus labor and dependence on capital provide the content of equal right. The inequalities characteristic of petty commodity production do not disappear. They persist in the wage form. Unequal individuals receiving the same wage will derive unequal benefits from it, but over and above these persisting inequalities, there are further inequalities of a new order. When we turn to the reproduction of capitalist society, we see that the real content of the exchange between capital and labor has changed once more. Previously, the exchange between capital and labor consisted of the expropriation of part of the worker's labor. But Marx then asked, what is the nature of the capital which the capitalist exchanges with labor power? The capitalist says that he worked hard for it, or that it is the product of his own labor. Even if this view of primitive accumulation were true, it ignores primitive accumulation based on robbery and international pillage. After several periods of production, the entire capital owned by the capitalist will consist of capitalized surplus value. That is, the product of the labor of workers expropriated by the capitalist and turned into capital. It is now revealed that the exchange between capital and labor is in content no exchange at all, since the capital which exchanges for labor is but the expropriated labor of workers from a previous period in transmuted form. Quote, the capitalist, it is true, pays him the value of the commodity, labor power, in money, but this money is merely the transmuted form of the product of his labor. The capitalist is constantly giving to the working class drafts in the form of money on a portion of the product produced by the latter, and appropriated by the former." End quote. Under these circumstances, the content of the exchange relation, that Eden of innate rights, is utterly transformed. Beneath the surface of equal exchange, we now find, when we view the matter from the perspective of capital as a whole and labor as a whole, an inversion of the exchange of equivalents, the appropriation of the product of one, quote, owner, end quote, by another without equivalent. Quote, "Each individual transaction continues to conform to the laws of commodity exchange, with the capitalist always buying labor power." Let me restart this. Quote, "Each individual transaction continues to conform to the laws of commodity exchange, with the capitalist always buying labor power and the worker always selling labor power at what we shall assume is labor power's real value. It is quite evident from this that the laws of appropriation of private property laws, based on the production and circulation of commodities, become changed into their direct opposite through their own internal and inexorable dialectic. The exchange of equivalents, the original operation with which we started, is now turned round in such a way that there is only an apparent exchange, since firstly the capital which is exchanged for labor power is itself merely a portion of the product of others, which has been appropriated without equivalent, and secondly, this capital must not only be replaced by its producer, the worker, but replaced with an added surplus. The relation of exchange between capitalist and worker becomes a mere semblance belonging only to the process of circulation. It becomes a mere form which is alien to the content of the transaction itself, and merely mystifies the content of the transaction. The constant sale and purchase of labor power is the form. The content is the constant appropriation by the capitalist without equivalent of a portion of the labor of others. Originally, the rights of property seemed to us to be grounded in man's own labor. Some such assumption was at least necessary, since only commodity owners with equal rights confronted each other, and the sole means of appropriating the commodities of others was the alienation of a man's own commodities, commodities which, however, could only be produced by labor. Now, however, property turns out to be the right on the part of the capitalist to appropriate the unpaid labor of others or its product, and the impossibility of the worker of appropriating his own product. The separation of property from labor thus becomes the necessary consequence of a law that apparently originated in their identity." End quote. Under these new relations of production, in which the content of equal right has undergone such enormous change, so too does its form. Just as capital represents means of production alienated from their producers, so the function of enforcing equal rights between capital and wage labor gives rise to a new form of legal authority, the state. That is, a public power alienated from the people, an independent force distinct from society which acquires its own institutions and its own personnel. But this aspect of capitalist relations of production is not pursued in capital. These passages show how the content of inequality is transformed with the reproduction of capitalist relations of production, while on the surface a free and equal exchange of equivalents proceeds apace. Beneath the surface, the law which presupposed ownership of the product of one's own labor, quote, turns into, through a necessary dialectic, an absolute divorce of property and appropriation of alien labor without exchange. End quote. Thus, while equal rights always mean inequality, it does not always mean the same inequality. Differences between one form of inequality and another form of inequality are a matter of great significance for the individuals involved. The story of the connection between capitalist relations of production and equal rights does not, of course, end here. Rather, this is its beginning. The socialization of labor under capital leads to the organization of the working class, who assert their rights as free laborers against the rights of capitalists as free owners of private property. Right is set against right, as Marx put it, and the outcome in law is the result of a struggle of class forces. Marx portrays this process vividly in his account of struggles over the 10-hour day. Quote, "The capitalist maintains his right as purchaser when he tries to make the working day as long as possible, and where possible to make 2 working days out of 1. On the other hand, the peculiar nature of the commodity sold implies a limit to its consumption by the purchaser. The worker maintains his right as a seller when he wishes to reduce the working day to a particular normal length. There is here, therefore, an antinomy of right against right, both equally bearing the seal of the law of exchange. Between equal rights, force decides." End quote. Relations of production between capital and labor are not static. They are not once given, forever fixed. Nothing is more stultifying in my view and less in the spirit of capital than to freeze its analysis of the capital-labor relation into a motionless frame. The content of inequality is not static, even though no amount of tinkering with the wages and conditions of work will abolish the exploitative nature of the capital-labor relation itself. However, Marx's argument that with the reproduction of the capital-labor relation, exchange becomes a, quote, mere semblance, end quote, a, quote, mere form alien to the content of the transaction, end quote, a mere, quote, mystification, end quote, may give rise to the idea that however real and important formal equality was in petty commodity production, formal equality loses all substance with the development of capitalism. This theme is present in the Grundrisse and in Capital. It mirrors the view of civil society as, quote, the worst possible slavery, end quote, put forward in the German ideology. Marx also, however, developed another quite different view of the significance of formal freedom and equality, which grasped far more adequately their contradictory character. The juridic significance of Marx's discovery that workers sell their labor power and not themselves or their labor was this. It enabled him to see that workers do not, as he previously thought, quote, sink to the level of a commodity, the most wretched commodity of all, end quote, but remain at all times owners of a commodity that is labor power. Workers are guardians of a commodity rather than being themselves commodities. Workers are in this sense free workers rather than slaves. Capitalist production, in other words, based on relations of exploitation and domination, was revealed as compatible with, not at odds with, juridic freedom and equality. Thus, capitalist reproduction does not imply a, quote, absolute divorce, end quote, between workers and property, since possession of one's own labor power as private property is the presupposition of wage labor. At the end of one cycle of production and the beginning of the next, the workers themselves are reproduced as workers. Still, if we exclude consideration of the state, in need of selling their labor power in order to survive, but still also free and equal possessors of one vital piece of property, which remains theirs, their own capacity to labor. Workers are not, quote, free of all belongings and possessions, of all property, end quote, as Marx continued to state in some passages of the Grundrisse. Their labor power remains their own. This differentiation from slavery was a matter of juridic and as well as economic importance. Marx was beginning to see in the Grundrisse that, quote, as a slave the worker has exchange value. As a free wage worker he has no value. It is rather the worker's power of disposing of his labor which has value. The worker is thereby formally posited as a person who is something for himself apart from his labor and who alienates his life expression only as a means towards his own life. For example, the sphere of his consumption is not qualitatively restricted, only quantitatively. This distinguishes the worker from the slave, end quote. The fact that workers are owners of their labor power and only grant temporary disposal of it to capital is, as Rosdolsky has clearly argued, quote, of decisive importance, since it counts as one of those features of the relation of wage labor which raises wage labor historically above other earlier modes of production. End quote. In slavery, direct producers themselves belong to individual particular owners. In serfdom, direct producers appear, quote, as a moment of property, land itself, an appendage of the soil exactly like drought cattle, end quote. The wage laborer, by contrast, quote, belongs to himself, end quote, sells his or her property, quote, to a particular capitalist whom he confronts as an independent individual, end quote. This grants to workers, as Rosdolsky put it, quote, a wide field of choice, of arbitrary will, hence of formal freedom, which the producers of other class societies lack, without which the workers' struggle for liberation would be simply inconceivable, end quote. By exchanging labor power for money, the worker even becomes, quote, a co-participant in general wealth up to the limit of his equivalent, end quote. Marx never overcame his ambivalence between his conception of bourgeois equality and freedom as, quote, only a semblance and a deceptive semblance, end quote, and his realization that, quote, this semblance exists nevertheless as an illusion on his, the worker's part, and to a certain degree on the other side, and thus essentially modifies his relation by comparison to that of workers in other modes of production, end quote. If this, quote, semblance, end quote, has such a palpable reality, then it should no longer be called a semblance. At the end of the day, what is important is not how Marx resolved or failed to resolve his own ambivalence, but how we resolve the problem which he expressed. The main point is this: workers under capitalism are not propertyless. Workers under capitalism remain at all times owners of private property, at best in the form of personal possessions, means of subsistence, and at worst in the form of labor capacity alone. It is this fact which turns ideologies centered around the sanctity of private property into viable means of persuasion rather than alien means of mere oppression. Marxists should relate to this rather than simply denounce private property as something entirely oppressive and bad, from which workers are entirely expropriated, in which they have no interest. Juridic freedom and equality, far from losing their social base with the extended reproduction of capital, are guaranteed a new foundation with the socialization of labor and its collective organization. This is a story beyond the scope of capital itself, but is one whose interpretation may be greatly informed by reading Capital.